Hello, good morning, everybody. Our lecture will start in 5 minutes. So please stay tuned and we'll start in 5 minutes. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this lecture on the 3 dimensions of EU policies. Today we will have a third lecture in our section on the global governance of trade. In the first lecture, we saw different types of mandatory governmental types of agreements which are increasingly relevant or integrated in trade policies. And then last Tuesday, Carrie Otterburn introduced a series of voluntary initiatives which are taken to govern trade and global value chains and had attention for the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises, the ILO Declaration on Multinational Enterprises, and the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Today, we will focus on a third aspect, and here we leave the realm of what governments do, and we go into what non-governmental actors and institutions are developing, and you will get an introduction into different types of approaches by non-governmental actors. And this will be presented by Charline Depoorter, who is a PhD researcher at our center and is doing a PhD on voluntary sustainability standards, on which you will hear more today. Before I give the floor to Charline, just to remind you, you can always type in questions in the question box on your right-hand side. So don't feel free to type in any questions you have, and then we will address the questions before the break or right after the break. So if you have any issues or questions, just feel free to let us know. Now I will hand over to Charline. Charline, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
All right, you have the floor.
All right, I hope everyone can see my screen. So hi everyone, I hope you can all hear me well as well. So first, thanks for attending the lecture. I know this is difficult times for everyone, and it can be hard to remain focused on some activities, but it's important that you keep up with the lecture and that we maintain more or less normal learning activities. So as Axel said, you were introduced to public governance on global trade, and Axel mentioned the governmental mechanisms, and Carrie mentioned the voluntary governmental rules. And today we are going to delve into non-governmental mechanisms for the governance of global trade. So non-governmental or non-state or private governance, or also sometimes called corporate social responsibility, it's all the same thing. It's about private actors that develop sets of standards or rules to govern economic activities. So these private actors can include firms as well as civil society organizations or NGOs. So in the governance triangle that was developed by Abbott and Snydel, and that Carrie described to you on Tuesday, we are looking at the bottom of the triangle in between firms and NGOs. And as we will see today, sometimes we are going to focus more on the firm side and sometimes more on the NGO side. But before we start, I would like to do a quick poll, and I will ask you if you know some non-governmental or private governance mechanisms for global trade. So you can see the instructions on the screen now. You should be able to join the poll either by through the web or also by text message. So I will wait for everyone to join, and okay, I will put that. All right, so I'm asking you to provide me with some examples of non-governmental mechanisms for the governance of global trade. So we'll wait a little bit for everyone to participate. Oops. So please try to answer with one word or one short expression, because as you will see, it's going to display on a word cloud, so it's easier if you answer with just one word or short expression. All right, WTO. Attention, press, forest, stewardship council. Okay. Trade, fair, I guess it's fair trade. Press. Self-regulation, companies. Max Havelaar. Standards. FSC. Whoa, there are a lot of answers. MSC. Codes of conduct, I guess. Dispute settlement. Organic. All right. Actions. Trade. Fair trade. Okay. You can stop now. I've seen quite a lot of interesting answers. Just to remind you that WTO is intergovernmental. It's not non-governmental, and you were introduced to the WTO by Axel last week. So, but fair trade, FSC. What did I see? Fair trade. All those are very good answers. So thanks for participating. Right, put back the presentation. All right, let's continue. So your answers to the poll show that there are a lot of different forms of non-governmental governance mechanisms for global trade. I also saw firms' codes of conduct, which is a very good answer. And so now we are going to delve into the different forms of non-state trade governance mechanisms. And we are actually going to delve into what Bernstein and Cashore described in their article in 2008. They provide quite an overview of the different non-state governance mechanisms, which they call corporate social responsibility in their paper, but it's basically what we are calling non-state trade governance. And I will not cover everything that they say in their paper, but I will cover the main and the most interesting forms of non-state governance. But if you are interested in learning more about that, of course, I encourage you to read the paper. The references are in the on the last slides that I will put online on Toledo. So first, the authors identify commitments of individual firms or the firm's codes of conduct, as you mentioned in the poll. So these commitments are the initiative of individual firms alone, and they can therefore take different forms and be more or less ambitious. So codes of conduct most of the time involve both internal and external commitments. So first, internal commitments refer to the behavior that the firm expects from its employees and the measures that it takes to achieve higher social, economic, or environmental conditions linked to its own activities. And so it can be about promoting health and safety of employees, ensuring fair working conditions, or, for example, developing smart water resource management or that kind of things. So on the slide, you can see now the code of conduct of Facebook, which includes requirements linked to conflict of interest, harassment, or communication of its employees, for example. But then within firms' codes of conduct, you also have external commitments. So this refers to requirements linked to the company's partners, and most often it's targeted at its suppliers. So for example, here on the slide, we see the requirements that H&M asks its suppliers to meet in relation to child labor, workers' rights, health and safety, or the environment, for example. All right, so that's very much self-regulation. And then you have another form of non-state governance mechanisms, which is pretty much the same as individual firms' codes of conduct, but it's at the industry level, so industry level codes of conduct. So in those cases, a code of conduct with also internal and external requirements is developed, but at the industry level. So it's really a collective effort from firms within the industry to improve their common practices. And one example of that is the Responsible Care Program, which sets commitments in the global chemical industry related to basically the safe management of chemicals. A third form of private governance of global trade is the partnerships between firms and NGOs. So this basically happens when those two actors have a common goal, and most of the time they set up partnerships on a specific project with for which they can both benefit from one another's expertise or also from their reputation. So for example, in 2015, Unilever and the World Wildlife Fund set up a one-year partnership to conduct a campaign to raise consumers' awareness about deforestation. So the advantage of those partnerships between firms and NGOs is that the general public is generally more likely to accept a project that is backed up by an NGO rather than by a firm alone, because NGOs bear more moral legitimacy. Then another type of non-state governance mechanisms is voluntary sustainability standards, or VSS. That's how we're going to call them. That's what we are going to analyze today in more details, even though there are other forms of non-state mechanisms that exist, as I mentioned in the paper from Old, Bernstein, and Cashore. There are a lot of other mechanisms, but I won't go into details. So in the literature, you can also find other terms for VSS. For example, you can see, you can find non-state market-driven mechanisms, or NSMD. They can also be called eco-labels or sustainability certificates or eco-certification, but these are basically all the same, and we are going to call them VSS. So on the slide now, you can see different examples of VSS. And I'm sure that when you go shopping, you've already encountered some of those labels, but often consumers don't really know what's behind these labels, what they mean, how they work, etc. So that's what we are going to find out in today's lecture. So first, what are VSS? So the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, the UNFSS, defines VSS as standards specifying requirements that producers, traders, manufacturers, retailers, or service providers may be asked to meet relating to a wide range of sustainability metrics, including respect for basic human rights, worker health and safety, the environmental impacts of production, community relations, land use, planning, and others. End of citation. So, as their name indicates, VSS are of course voluntary, so it means that they are not mandatory and that basically any actor along a global value chain can apply to a VSS scheme. Also, they aim to improve social and/or environmental impacts of economic activities by implementing more sustainable practices in the different production processes. And this is of course done by the means of standards or rules that are developed by VSS agencies and that adopters of VSS must meet in order to be certified. Okay, so that's for the definition, but how do they work concretely? So as we said, first, a VSS agency develops a set of sustainability standards, and a producer or any other actor along global value chains can then apply to the scheme, and therefore he has to implement the sustainability standards into his production practices. But while anyone can apply to a VSS scheme, as I said, it has to be noted that VSS are mainly used for producers in developing countries because they are really important instruments to integrate those producers into global value chains and give them access to markets that are sensitive to sustainability issues, which is not always the case in developing countries, but more in our developed countries. And selling their products on those sensitive markets to sustainability, it can also theoretically result in a price premium for those producers, because consumers in sensitive markets can be willing to pay more for sustainable products. Sorry. I'm sure that you've already noticed that when you go shopping, that a product with a label tends to be more expensive than non-certified products. So compliance with the standards is then assessed by an independent third party, which is accredited by the VSS agency, and it conducts independent monitoring. So the VSS adopter, if the VSS adopter effectively complies with the standards that is developed by the VSS agency, then he is given a certificate as well as a label that he can put on his products. And this serves as a proof of compliance with the standards. So the label also means for the VSS adopter, it's a means to differentiate its products on the market, as I said earlier. And if the VSS adopter does not comply with the standards, then corrective action plans can be developed, which basically consist in drawing a plan of different adjustments that the VSS adopter has to make in his practices in order to comply with the standards. But also, VSS agency can also decide to suspend the certificate for the VSS adopter in case of non-compliance. That differs between different VSS schemes. So VSS are an important tool for the transfer of information, both from the standards agencies to standards adopters, as well as from standards adopters to their consumers or buyers. So VSS can first make VSS adopters benefit from knowledge or expertise from VSS agencies about how to sustainably manage their operations. And the advantage is that it can result in an increase in productivity and maybe also a decrease in production costs. So the reason for that is that VSS agencies often support VSS adopters about how to implement the standards, but of course not all VSS agencies do that, but some do. And then VSS can also serve as a tool to transfer information from producers, so standards adopters, to consumers or buyers. So global value chains have become very complex, and it's hard for consumers or other intermediary actors along global value chains to know in which conditions the products are produced. So VSS basically help increase transparency in global value chains, because certification or the labels on the products really serve as a proof of compliance with the standards, and it can also therefore serve the producer's reputation. We will see that later in the lecture. Okay, so that's for how they work, but you might also be wondering how VSS are governed internally, how and whether they are recognized, how widely they are adopted, whether they are effective in creating positive social or environmental outcomes on the ground. And I will actually answer all those questions because it all refers to the concept of effectiveness. So when we talk about the effectiveness of VSS, basically it entails 4 different dimensions. So, and we will go over all of them, of course. So first, the institutional effectiveness of VSS refers to both the design of VSS and their content, so the content of the standards. Then constitutive effectiveness is about how VSS are recognized and by whom. And third, process effectiveness also refers to how widely VSS are adopted. And then goal attainment effectiveness refers to the degree to which VSS achieve their specific goals that they set out in the principles and in the standards on the ground. So it's really about evaluating the socio-economic and environmental impacts of VSS on the ground for producers. So the 4 dimensions are, of course, equally important to evaluate the overall effectiveness of VSS, because a VSS that is effective in creating positive impacts on the ground, for example, on the environmental dimension, but if this VSS is not adopted by many entities, then it cannot be really considered as effective. And the other way around, if a VSS is widely adopted but has very little impact on the ground or is badly governed, then it can also not be really judged as effective. So we will look into those 4 dimensions now. So first institutional effectiveness. So we will now see how VSS are formed, how they are governed, and what their content is. So, but before we delve into that, I will go over the emergence of VSS. It's really important to understand that VSS are formed mainly by firms and NGOs or civil society actors together. So in the governance triangle that we saw and that you saw with Carrie on Tuesday, VSS are really situated at the bottom of the triangle, just in between firms and NGOs. And so VSS are formed by firms and civil society together. And this is because in the 80s, public awareness of the negative impacts of trade increased. People began to be more conscious about environmental and social impacts of economic activities, which Axel explained to you last week, have really increased in size and also changed in nature because it really globalized with global value chains. So in the 80s, there were a lot of boycotts and naming and shaming campaigns targeted at firms that had negative impacts on socio-economic or environmental conditions. And for example, in the forestry sector, there was a massive boycott on tropical wood products in the 80s because those products were linked to deforestation, biodiversity loss, and other adverse environmental effects. So in response to that, NGOs conducted naming and shaming campaigns as well, in addition to the boycotts against these tropical wood companies. So, but the forestry sector is, of course, only just one specific case, but public awareness on the whole rose for other sectors as well. And there were important, huge needs and important calls for more industry regulations from the public. So, of course, as a response to those calls, states try to develop policies and regulations to make industries more sustainable. But if you read the literature on that, you will see that those efforts were mainly considered as failures because, for example, again, in the forestry sector, the International Tropical Timber Organization was set up in '86 to protect tropical forests. In '87, the Tropical Forestry Action Plan was also developed to encourage developing countries to establish their national forest program in order to monitor sustainable forest management. But on the whole, those tools were very narrow in scope and they were non-binding. And yeah, one more example is also the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, so the UNCED, which was held in Rio in '92, and during which states basically failed to develop a binding agreement on the protection of worldwide forests. So this again is only for the forestry sector, but it is the case for other sectors as well. And these multiple failures from states to regulate is due to a lack of willingness from states, as well as from firms who lobby governments to develop industry regulations. But these failures is also sometimes due to a lack of capacity to enforce new regulations. But in any case, these multiple failures to regulate created a governance gap. So as a consequence, because there were still calls from the public to regulate those industries, NGOs and firms got together and decided to create their own regulations. So in the forestry industry, this led to the establishment in 1993 of the Forest Stewardship Council, the FSC, as one of you mentioned in the poll. This is basically one of the leading VSS in the forestry sector, along with the PEFC, so the Program for the Endorsement of Forest Certification. So the FSC was in fact created by several environmental NGOs, such as the World Wildlife Fund, the National Wildlife Federation, and the Rainforest Alliance, and also Friends of the Earth. And of course, as well, with firms, including IKEA and B&Q and Home Depot. So you might also wonder, what is the interest for the private sector or firms basically to join with NGOs to create VSS? What's their interest in implementing sustainability standards in their own business practices? Well, there are three main reasons that can be put forward. So first, by creating or adopting VSS, firms mitigate reputational risks. So as I just said, in the 80s, there were a lot of naming and shaming campaigns towards firms that were conducted by NGOs. And nowadays, NGOs have even more power in that sense. So first, firms that commit to sustainable practices reduce the risk that NGOs blame them publicly, which can really harm their brand image. A second reason for firms to take up VSS is that it allows them to preempt states' regulations, because as a firm, you would prefer developing your own standards to show the state that you are already implementing sustainable practices, rather than waiting for the states to regulate the industry, not only because public regulations could be more stringent than the VSS that you could adopt, but also because you could face important transition costs to comply with the public regulations. And these transition costs can be reduced by already implementing sustainable practices in your business operations. A third reason for firms to take up VSS is, of course, their real concern for sustainability issues and the real commitment to that. But this is quite idealistic, and actually there is a very good study by Galati and co-authors from 2017, and they find that the true concern for sustainability issues is not the main reason why firms adopt VSS. It's more about market access and reputation. I really encourage you to read that paper. It's very well structured, and it shows very different motivations for firms to take up VSS. All right, so back to institutional effectiveness of VSS. So as we've seen, VSS are most often created by firms and NGOs together, but institutional design of VSS includes different aspects, and across VSS they can vary very much. A first aspect of institutional design of VSS is decision making, which is about how and by whom decisions are made. So VSS by nature are multi-stakeholder. As we saw, they are created by firms and NGOs, but they can also include other actors such as academic experts or basically any individual who wishes to participate. This is also not the case for all VSS, but this is what they tend to do. And most VSS are built in such a way that they try to ensure that the different interests are equally represented. So for example, within the FSC's General Assembly, decision-making is shared between three chambers, which respectively represent economic, social, and environmental interests. And within those three chambers, developing countries and developed countries are also equally represented. Again, this is not the case for all VSS, and there are, of course, a lot of VSS where corporate interests, so economic interests, really dominate decision making. So besides decision making in VSS, should also be consensus based and open to new members and transparent, meaning that VSS should provide the opportunity for anyone to join and should publish decision making procedures and reports, but this again can vary very much across VSS. So then VSS agencies develop a set of guiding principles. So those are the general objectives that the VSS aims to achieve. And depending on the VSS, those general objectives can be more targeted at addressing social issues or environmental issues. Then VSS develop a set of standards, which basically operationalize the guiding principles into measurable and unambiguous standards or benchmark that will allow for conformity assessments. But here as well, depending on different VSS schemes, standards can be more or less measurable and more or less unambiguous. Standards can be also more or less stringent, which reflects how ambitious a VSS agency is in its efforts to implement sustainable practices. But you might think that as VSS are really voluntary, firms or producers would not want to adopt VSS that include very stringent standards because it would be too much of an unnecessary burden for them. But actually, there is a very good study from Katka and Corbett from 2016, and they show that more stringent VSS are not associated with lower levels of adoption, and they say that it could be explained by the fact that the cost of adoption is in the end not so high, or that the benefits of certification is higher than the cost. But they also show in the paper that this finding, so that stringent VSS are not associated with lower levels of adoption, could also be reflecting a selection bias in the sense that VSS that are too loose in their requirements, as well as the VSS that are too stringent, tend to disappear due to low adoption, and that the remaining or surviving VSS that the authors could analyze in their study are really an in-between in terms of stringency, but even within that in-between, they find that there is still differences in the stringency, of course, and they find that there is no link between stringency and adoption levels. So if you are interested in that, you can also read that paper. It's very interesting. So to continue, standards can also make references to existing international conventions. Collins and co-authors wrote a report in 2017, and they showed that a lot of VSS cite international laws or norms in their standards, and they make references to ILO core conventions, for example, but also to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, or to the UN declarations on human rights. And basically they show that about 78% of the VSS that they analyzed make those references to international conventions. And Axel also worked on that topic, and he finds comparable results. So what does this tell us about VSS, that they include international norms? It tells us that VSS can really be in line with existing international regulations, and that they can therefore serve as a tool to enforce those regulations or future regulations, that they can really be an interesting enforcement tool. But I will expand more on that a bit later. So, okay, so it's, oh, sorry, I forgot. Okay, so VSS agencies can also develop standards in a way that they are they can be adapted to local standards. And Nava and Tempe worked on that in a paper, and they show that VSS often face a barrier because there is a lack of fit between the standards that they develop and the local context, environmental, social, economic, or also cultural context. So they really put forward that the VSS that defines standards that can be adapted to those different contexts will be more effective. But of course, this is again not the case for all VSS. So that was for standard setting. Another dimension of VSS institutional design is the enforcement mechanisms that they have. So first, VSS can have, they do have top-down enforcement mechanisms, which consist in monitoring or auditing procedures, which assess compliance of VSS adopters with the standards. And this monitoring is conducted by an accredited independent third party who fills out basically a questionnaire or a checklist to verify that VSS adopters meet the standards. And this checklist approach really has the advantage that it quantifies the conditions on the ground, and it is standardized, so it can allow for comparisons among different adopters. The frequency of this monitoring and auditing can also vary a lot according to VSS. For some, it's once a year. For others, it's just random checks. Others do every other year, etc. It can really vary. So I'm also coming back to third-party certification because it's very important. It contributes to the credibility of VSS as well, because third-party certification is considered more legitimate than first or second party. So first-party monitoring involves only one actor. So that's what we saw at the beginning of the lecture with firms' codes of conduct, for example. So firms set up their own standards or commitments, and they on their own monitor their progress on those commitments. And so this is considered as the least credible form of monitoring because, well, it's only basically self-regulation. Then there is also second party, which involves two parties, one that sets standards and monitors compliance, and the other one that adopts and implements the standards. So first and second parties certification or verification is really considered as self-regulation and not really credible. But then, of course, third-party certification, which VSS apply, involves three parties. So first, the one that sets standards, the second one implements the standards, and then the third one monitors compliance and reports to the standards agency. And yeah, that's what we saw at the beginning when I explained how VSS work. But there are also a lot of criticisms about the auditing in VSS schemes. And these criticisms include the fact that auditing can be very selective on some issues. For example, they often pay more attention to some issues such as working conditions or wages, but they are less concerned about issues such as freedom of association, for example. Then there is also a criticism about the fact that global value chains are very complex and they are therefore very it's difficult to monitor them. And there is also a question about the quality of information that auditing agencies collect, because the voices of local stakeholders are often not taken into account, and auditing companies can also often do a very quick job and miss crucial information by completing those checklists. Okay, so that was for top-down enforcement. But VSS also have bottom-up mechanisms for enforcement. This mainly involves complaint mechanisms and dispute settlement. So this means that anyone, any producer or firm can report non-compliance with the standards and complaint procedures or dispute settlement mechanisms exist to solve those issues. Then, of course, the legitimacy of VSS also relies a lot on their transparency. And transparency of VSS is twofold. First, it can be procedural. So this refers to the fact that VSS make their decision-making, standard setting, and enforcement mechanisms publicly available. And then VSS can also apply outcome transparency, which means that they publish the impacts that they have on the ground. And lastly, the last dimension of institutional design of VSS is about sanctioning. So as we saw earlier, in case of non-compliance, there can be sanctions. And this can be done in different ways. As I mentioned, corrective action plans to develop plans that the VSS adopter must follow to change its practices and implement the standards. And of course, if you want to keep the certification. And this is quite constructive because it provides a lot of support to VSS adopters because they might not always have managerial or knowledge resources to implement the standards into their practices. So VSS corrective action plans can really be helpful in that sense. And then, of course, the last sanction mechanism is the suspension of the certificate. Most often, if a VSS adopter repeatedly doesn't comply with the standards. Okay, so as I mentioned several times, a VSS can really vary a great deal in all those different dimensions. And Axel Marx and Jan Wouters actually conducted a research on the institutional diversity of VSS. And that's exactly what they measured. They analyzed 4 dimensions of VSS. So they first analyzed whether they have open and consensus-based standard setting procedures, whether compliance is assessed by a third party, whether they disclose information to the public, and whether they have dispute settlement mechanisms. So the results show that VSS, of course, greatly differ. As you can see on the slide, VSS are not all concentrated in only one box. They are spread out, but you can see also that most of them have consensus-based standard setting procedures, but no transparency and no dispute settlement mechanisms. And you can also see that only 12 of them score actually positive on the 4 dimensions that are under study. So this means that there are quite a lot of VSS according to this study, that are not really credible, and that suggests that there is quite a lot of greenwashing among VSS. So that was for institutional effectiveness. Now we're going to look into constitutive effectiveness. This is to understand why VSS are accepted or recognized by different actors, and in particular by firms, by governments, by the VSS community itself, and by consumers. So as I said earlier, VSS have really flourished in the 90s for the reasons I explained. And we can see on the graph here that we can see the increase really in the number of VSS in the 90s. And we can see that this growth continues until the mid 2010. And then it started to stagnate a little bit. So the 2 lines that you see on the graph represent the number of VSS according to 2 different databases, the ITC Standards Map and the Ecolabel Index. And the reason why there is a difference in the number of VSS that they count is that they have different methodologies, but this is not so much important. The important thing is that they basically show the same trend that VSS really flourished in the 90s. But of course, VSS could really flourish only because they are recognized or accepted by several stakeholders, and that's what we are going to look into. So first, recognition by firms. So why firms recognize VSS? So we have already explained a little bit of that. It mainly relates to the fact that VSS are a good tools for firms to manage reputational risks, so avoid naming and shaming campaigns from NGOs and the public, and preserve their image. And then they also recognize VSS because it's a good way to preempt government regulations, as I explained, and also because of a real concern for sustainability issues, even though, as we saw, this is not very often the case. But the fourth reason is also that VSS are mainstreaming. So in the beginning, VSS were rather like a niche market, but increasingly they are mainstreaming. And this is due to the fact that some steps of global value chains are increasingly concentrated, and particularly there is a huge concentration in retailing companies. So these companies really have a lot of bargaining power. And this means that if a retailing company which has a lot of power decides to adopt VSS, then VSS will easily be diffused along supply chains. And this is what is increasingly happening with VSS, and they increasingly become recognized really as a tool to prove compliance with standards and with requirements that firms can have. And one example of that is that the company B&Q, for example, decided in 2001 that it would refuse to purchase lumber from Canada that is not certified by the FSC. IKEA also did the same in 2012. It basically committed to source 50% of its wood material from recycled or FSC certified forests. So you see that the requirements of firms which have a lot of bargaining power will indeed affect other actors in global value chains. So that was for firms, but now let's look into why VSS are recognized by governments. So this is expressed mainly in three ways. First, governments can include standards requirements in their sustainable public procurement. So public procurement accounts for almost, on average, 20% of a country's GDP. And more governments commit to purchase goods or services that are sustainable. In the EU, for example, there is a directive on sustainable public procurement called Green Public Procurement. And this lays out the criteria that certification schemes have to meet in order to be recognized as a certification system in the context of public procurement. Then governments also increasingly include VSS in their public policies. In the EU, for example, there is the Renewable Energy Directive, and for this, the European Commission has accredited some VSS, and so complying with this VSS acts as a proof of compliance with the EU directive for biofuels providers. And another example, which is very interesting, is the Korean Timber Act, which stipulates that timber that is imported on the Korean market has to meet sustainability criteria. And the Act recognizes some VSS, such as the FSC and the PEFC, as a proof of compliance with this regulation. All right, then, of course, still in public policies, but more about trade policy, governments can also include VSS requirements on the products that are imported on their markets. This can be done in two ways. First, there is the mandatory approach, which involves that certification is needed before granting market access and preferences to a firm. So this means basically that firms first have to comply with VSS, and then they can sell their products on the market. And then the second approach is the voluntary approach, which involves basically that market access is granted to everyone, but that certified products have more preferences for example, lower duties. Okay, and lastly, governments can also recognize VSS through more indirect means, for example, creating an enabling environment for VSS to operate in. So there are some authors, such as Pierre and Peters, you can find the references on the last slides. They have framed the relationship between VSS or private regulations and state regulation as either or a zero-sum game, in the sense that they think that private regulation would replace public regulation. But we see that this is not the case, and we have already seen that VSS can be really complementary to governments because they are a tool to enforce standards and monitor compliance, and VSS also have similar sustainability requirements as governments can have, and we saw that with the fact that a lot of VSS includes references to international conventions. We also see that in any case, one VSS is always active within a state's jurisdiction, so the relationship between private and public regulation cannot be either or, as some authors said, because VSS is always subject to a state's regulation. But of course, states can create an enabling environment for VSS through their different public policies. This can be social policy, economic policy, fiscal policy, etc. All right. So firms, okay, so now about the recognition of VSS by VSS themselves. It's also very important because recognition of VSS means that one VSS recognizes another VSS as being equivalent. But this recognition can be unidirectional, meaning that one VSS X recognizes a VSS Y, but the other way around is not correct, meaning that VSS Y does not recognize as VSS X. And then VSS recognition can also be mutual, which involves that both VSS recognizes each other as equivalent. So mutual recognition is really important because if you are a producer and you meet the requirements of VSS X, for example, you will be certified under that VSS. But if there is mutual recognition, then it would also allow you to be certified under VSS Y, because it's recognized by VSS X and the other way around. So for producers, this would really reduce the costs of multiple certification and allow them to use both labels on their products as well. So they could also qualify to sell their products on more markets. But mutual recognition, as you saw in the reading for today, it still needs to be improved in the VSS markets, because now mutual recognition is not very intensive because they have VSS have very different visions, standards, or enforcement procedures. And as we saw earlier in their institutional design, VSS can be very diverse. So the diversity of VSS on the market also means that it's a very competitive market, and that there is a risk that some VSS lower their standards to increase their adoption levels. So this is very problematic because it creates a race to the bottom, and it also, of course, jeopardizes the credibility of VSS. Because if all VSS lower their standards, then it just becomes pure greenwashing, and it's not about improving sustainability anymore. So to prevent that from happening, there is really a need for meta-regulation in the VSS markets, meaning that an organization would define criteria that VSS schemes have to meet in order to be considered as credible. And this is what the ISIL Alliance is trying to do, as you saw in the reading for today. In a way, they they define a set of minimum standards that standard setting agencies have to meet to be considered as credible. All right, before we do the break, I will just finish with the recognition of VSS by consumers, which is also very important, of course. So this involves that consumers consider certified products as superior or at least different from other products, and that they are sensitive to sustainability issues and to sustainably produced goods. So some studies show that consumer demand for sustainable products is increasing, especially in developed countries, but the literature is quite inconclusive on whether VSS really play a role in that. So the studies rather tend to show that there is a lot of confusion for consumers, and it's hard for them to differentiate between certification schemes and to know what's behind the labels. So there is really a need to increase consumer awareness, and in that sense, meta regulation can also help because they would really classify and help recognize credible VSS from non-credible ones. Okay, so I suggest we have a break now. We'll have a 10 minutes break. I don't know if Axel, if there are some questions.
That's fine. No, for the moment, there are no questions.
Okay.
So suppose we have a break until 15 minutes past 12.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, see you in a few minutes. Hello, welcome back. We're going to start with the second part of the lecture by Charline. Charline, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Axel. Okay, hope this works again. All right. So before the break, we saw institutional effectiveness and constitutive effectiveness. We still have to cover process effectiveness and goal attainment effectiveness. So first, process effectiveness. Do you all see my screen? Yes, all right, perfect. So process effectiveness is about how widely VSS are adopted and where. So as we saw, VSS have really flourished and their number has greatly increased in the 90s and until the mid 2010. But this increase doesn't mean that VSS are being increasingly adopted in the same way everywhere. So that's why studying process effectiveness is important. And on the whole, we see that adoption of VSS is actually non-homogeneous, and it can really differ according to the sector, the geography, and commodity that we are studying. So first, we are going to see that VSS are more active in some sectors than others. So on the slide, you can see on the graph that the majority of VSS actually exists in agricultural sector, and that there is also quite a lot of VSS in the garment sector and in consumer product and processed food. But those categories are not very clearly defined, and it can also be noted that some VSS are active in different sectors at the same time. But you see that in general, the agri-food sector and the garment sector count the highest number of VSS. Whereas sectors such as electronics and jewelry at the very end of the graph have only a few VSS. So another way to look at adoption of VSS is looking at the number of VSS that are active in different countries. So on the basis of the ITC standards maps, which I have already introduced that to you earlier. It's a database on VSS. I constructed the map that you see now on the slide, and you can see that some countries, for example, Brazil or the US, Mexico, China, India, Indonesia, they count quite a lot of VSS active on their territory, and in fact, they have more than 40% of all existing VSS active in their country. Then you also have countries that count very few VSS. For example, Bhutan, Somalia, Libya, Iraq, Chad. These are all countries that barely have VSS. But the question is, of course, why some countries have more VSS than others. The exact reasons are, of course, not entirely clear, but studies tend to suggest that open economies with diversified economic sectors and exports in countries with relatively well-functioning governments and a certain level of development tend to take up more VSS. But looking at how many VSS a country counts on its territory doesn't really say much about how widely these VSS are used within the territory, how many entities are certified, or how large the certified production area is. So for this, we can also have a look at how many certificates are issued by VSS. So this could provide us with an idea of how many entities are certified, but that's rather difficult because as we saw in the institutional design of VSS, not all VSS are equally transparent. Some of them report the number of certificates that they issue in a rather systematic way, but not all VSS do that. So it's really hard to actually get the numbers of total certificates of VSS in the world. But another way to look at adoption is by looking at the area that is certified. So As we saw, most VSS are active in agri-food products, so we can estimate the cropland area that is certified globally. And actually, there are studies from Taylor and co-authors, as well as by Wheeler and co-authors, that show that about 1.2% of global cropland is certified. And this, of course, might not seem to be a lot, but their studies also show that the certified area actually grows by 11% per year in the world. So this is more significant. And in the forestry industry, the numbers are even more impressive, because the PEFC and the FSC, as we mentioned earlier, these are the two leading VSS in the forestry sector. These two only, they certify more than 20% of the world's forests. So this is quite impressive. But again, I have to say that adoption of VSS in different sectors is not geographically homogeneous. So for example, the report by Wheeler and co-authors showed that the production area that is certified for some commodities, so coffee, cocoa, palm oil, banana, tea, cotton, sugarcane, and soybeans, is increasing globally. But another study by Taylor and co-authors shows that within the producing countries, certification is more intensive in some areas than others. So for the study, they basically mapped more than 1 million certified farms across all VSS, and they analyzed 30 by 30 kilometers cells, and they tried to see where certified farms were present. And they actually find that about 4% of those cells contain certified farms. So on the slides, these are their results. And you can see the mapping of where the commodities are produced in light colors, and the dark colors indicate where the certified production is located. So for example, for banana here on the first image, well, you can see that banana is produced quite in a lot of tropical countries, but certified production of bananas is actually mostly in Central America. You can see more or less the same pattern for coffee, and for certified cocoa, it's mainly in West Africa. And for palm oil, it's mainly in Indonesia. They also study other commodities, so soybeans, tea, and sugarcane. So you can really see that the production area doesn't mean that this is a certified area, and you can really see that it's not homogeneously distributed. And the authors actually show that the concentration of certification is mainly in areas that are important for biodiversity conservation, but not in the areas that are most in need for poverty alleviation. So this actually refers to what we call the stuck at the bottom problem. So this involves that the countries that would be most in need for poverty alleviation and other sustainability improvements are less likely to be certified, because they face difficulties to comply with VSS requirements. And this is actually for several reasons, because there is an important governance gap, for example. So this means that in those countries, government regulations are often quite low, and the producers are used to low requirements in their practices. So if they want to comply with VSS requirements, it involves for them a lot more investment costs, and they need to change a lot of practices. They need technical capacity and know-how in order to be able to comply with the VSS standards. And in comparison, in developed countries, there are usually more regulations in place already. So producers are mostly used to already meeting certain standards of production. So complying with VSS requirements is actually easier for them. And so we really see that the stuck to the bottom problem involves that only the producers that already have prior income and assets have the potential to apply for VSS schemes and implement them effectively, because getting certified involves a lot of costs linked to changes in practices, and so the poorest producers and typically the smallholders, farmers in developing countries, don't have the capacity to get certified. And the fact that they are not certified actually can also be a barrier to entry on some markets that are more sensitive to sustainable production. So in that sense, VSS can also act as a non-tariff barrier to trade in some cases. And so this stuck to the bottom problem actually skews a little bit the adoption levels of VSS, because they don't take into account the poor farmers that cannot get certified. So a last way to analyze VSS adoption, we can also look at the percentage of certified. Yeah.
Charline, can I come in for a second?
Because
yeah, sure. Raised his hand. So I think he has a question, so I will give him the floor.
Yeah.
Martin, can you hear us? Martin? Okay. This is not working, so I propose you continue, and I will be in contact with Martin over the chat box.
Okay, perfect. So as I said, so the last way to look at the adoption levels of VSS is to look at the proportion of certified products within specific markets. So again, the report from Wheeler and co-authors show that for the 8 commodities that they analyze between 2008 and 2016, sorry, there is really an increase in the percentage of commodities that are certified. So you can see on the slide, for the coffee sector, it's really striking, because you see that in 2008 there was about 9% of the global production of coffee that was certified, and in 2016 you see that this proportion jumped to over 45%. In the cocoa sector, it's also more or less the same. The production grew from about 3% to more than 37% in just 8 years. And you can see the same for certified palm oil as well, which grew from 2% to 12%, and for the other commodities as well. So it shows that on the whole, certification is really gaining grounds on different commodities markets. So that was for adoption of VSS, so process effectiveness. Let's now look at goal attainment effectiveness. So this is about.
Can I come in?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, there's one question by a student on the process effectiveness. Yeah. And the question relates to the stuck at the bottom problem. And the student wants to know whether microfinancing institutions, so the institutions who provide microcredit to producers or to individuals, or official development assistance in terms of development cooperation, could help achieve producers to obtain VSS and maybe resolve the stuck at the bottom problem.
Yeah, of course. Why not? As I said, there is certification costs can be very high in comparison to some small producers' income. So of course, microfinancing could be a good way to solve that. And there is actually other systems that are being put in place to help those smallholder producers getting certified without bearing too much costs. And it's basically about group certification. So some VSS develop group certification, so that they basically certify a group of smallholder producers together, so they can basically share the costs of certification. It's more interesting for them, and for VSS, it's also for VSS agencies. I mean, it's also interesting because there is also a kind of a social control within that group of smallholders, because everyone checks on everyone else to see if everyone complies with the standards in order not to lose the group certification. So yeah, there are quite interesting mechanisms that are put in place to help those smallholders producers. I hope this answers the question.
Yes, it's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so now let's go. I don't know if there are other questions, but maybe we can keep them for after the presentation. So I'm almost done. We just have to cover the goal attainment effectiveness. So as I said, it's about measuring the impacts of VSS on the ground. And a lot of studies have been done and are being done on evaluating the sustainability impacts of VSS. But the thing is, on the whole, the evidence remains inconclusive on whether VSS really improves sustainability or not. And this is because most studies usually focus on single VSS, so comparison is hard to make, and VSS can be very different in their requirements and enforcement procedures. So as we saw in the institutional designs of VSS. Also, some studies analyze the impacts of VSS at the global level, and other studies focus on local levels a bit everywhere in the world. And different studies also analyze different parameters or indicators and different components of sustainability, because as you know, sustainability is 3 pillars: social, economic, and environmental pillars. So there are really a lot of sustainability metrics to be measured, and the different studies have their own indicators that they measure. And impact studies also don't use the same methodologies, and it's really hard to have an overall an overview of the overall impact of VSS. And of course, this also varies, as you can see on the slide. It also varies across sector, whether you are studying the impacts of VSS in the coffee sector, in the cocoa sector, in the electronic sector, in the garment sector. It can be very, very different. So as I said, those studies have very mixed results, and I can give some examples. So in the forestry industry, for example, studies show on the whole that certification improves the organization, the administration, and the management of forest resources. Also that safety and well-being of workers is improved. That on the whole biodiversity conservation is also improved. And that deforestation is slowed down, but and also that for some certified firms, it provides them with access to more markets. But also on the negative side, the studies on the forestry sector also tend to show that certification requires important investments in sustainable forest management. Also that certified producers don't get the expected price premium for the certified products. And also that standards in the forestry sector are quite stringent and thus very difficult to implement, especially for smallholder in developing countries, as we mentioned. In the garment industry also, certification seems to improve some environmental aspects, for example, pollution, and they also seem to improve some working conditions such as working hours or wages, but it fails to improve procedural rights. So this is, for example, freedom of association. And in the agricultural sector, results are also very mixed. There are really a lot of studies that are conducted on many different agricultural commodities and in many different countries as well. So there is really no consensus, but studies tend to show that market access remains problematic for smallholder farmers, and as we saw earlier, because this is due to the cost of certification that remains high for them. And there is also no strong evidence that certification results in a price premium, and also limited evidence of improvement of working conditions. So on the whole, the results are very inconclusive, and the impact of VSS really depends on the context, and because they can have very positive impacts in one country, in one location with specific conditions, but applied to another context, it doesn't have the same impact. So VSS most of the time can have positive impacts also on some aspects of sustainability, but not on all of them. This is very difficult to achieve, also because some VSS, as I said earlier, focus more on social issues and other VSS more on environmental issues. Lastly, VSS also differ a lot in the institutional design, so their impact can of course not be the same. And this is actually the research that I am conducting. I'm analyzing basically how different institutional design characteristics of VSS that we saw earlier can have different impacts on the ground on different sustainability metrics. And so the aim is really to identify which types of institutional design result in the most positive impacts on sustainability. So as a conclusion, we see that in terms of effectiveness, VSS are really mixed. So first on institutional effectiveness, we see that a large diversity of VSS, and so not all of them are, of course, credible in their institutional design characteristics. On constitutive effectiveness, we also see that VSS are quite well adopted by most actors, so firms, governments, VSS themselves, and consumers. Although for consumers, there is still a lot of confusion about VSS. Then on process effectiveness, we also saw that different indicators show that adoption is increasing globally, but that this is not happening in a homogeneous manner. So I also remind you that while adoption and coverage of VSS are growing, the stuck to the bottom problem remains. And so it involves that, again, smallholder producers don't have the capacity to get involved in VSS schemes. And so it can be a barrier to trade. And then lastly, we saw for goal attainment effectiveness that the results are very mixed and context dependent. So there is really, it's really important to conduct more research to understand what it is within the institutional design of VSS that can determine positive or negative sustainability outcomes on the ground. And if we understand that, then VSS can be able to optimize their practices and make more significant progress towards sustainability. And as a conclusion, non-governmental mechanisms for the governance of global trade can be very diverse, as we saw at the very beginning of the lecture. But among the different types of private governance, VSS are very interesting tools, and they are quite significant actually to regulate global value chains, and because they act as a tool to transfer information, as we saw, and they serve as a proof of compliance with sustainability standards. And they are therefore very interesting tools for governments to translate their own sustainability commitments into practice. And we see that they are increasingly used by governments for this purpose, actually. And in particular, I would also like to mention that VSS have a lot of synergies with the SDGs. So you should all know how the SDGs are constructed and put in place now, because you are, of course, all following the MOOC on the SDGs. But indeed, VSS have great potential to make progress on many SDGs, because the VSS and the SDGs rely on the same sustainability paradigm, and they share common goals. So more intuitively, VSS are, of course, linked to SDG 12 on sustainable consumption, because they aim to inform and encourage consumers to buy certified and sustainable products. But there are also a lot of other synergies between VSS and the SDGs. For example, VSS that focus on social issues, for example, improved working conditions. This totally contributes to SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth. And other VSS in the forestry sector, for example, the FSC, they aim at slowing down deforestation and at protecting wildlife habitat. And so this is again totally in line with SDG 15 on life on land, for example. And there are a lot of other synergies, and in particular SDG 17 as well on partnerships for the goals, because as I mentioned earlier, VSS can be used by governments to translate their sustainability commitments into practice through different ways. So as a final note, don't forget the MOOC. I know that some of you said that it's a bit too easy and too introductive maybe, but if you're interested, have a look. I think it can still be relevant for you. So I don't know if there are other questions.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Charline. I got two questions in. One question really relates to what you mentioned at the end and made the link to the SDGs. And the student asks whether she was wondering if the SDGs like no poverty, no hunger, and decent work may also influence the stuck at the bottom problem for the better. In other words, might pursuing the SDGs also to a degree resolve the problem of the stuck at the bottom problem for certain producers?
Yeah, of course. And it's really a loop between the SDGs and VSS when we talk about smallholder farmers, because of course, if actions are taken to achieve the SDGs, for example, on no poverty or no hunger, of course, this will enable smallholder producers to have more capacities, more income, and then of course, then be able to apply to VSS schemes and so get certified. So it's really a feedback loop, and each other is reinforcing itself.
All right, thank you very much. Another question relates to VSS and trade policy. You addressed the fact that VSS sometimes tend to be included in trade agreements. And the student wants to know whether this is a process which is often used or whether it's more an exception.
Well, for now, it remains, I would say that it remains an exception in terms of naming explicitly some VSS. So as I mentioned, the Korean Timber Act, you can have a look on the internet, you can find it. They really mention explicitly that the FSC and the PEFC are recognized as proof of compliance with what Korea expects timber producers to meet. But this is quite an exception because most trade agreements mostly refer to requirements that they would expect certification schemes to meet in order to be recognized as relevant, such as the EU directive on renewable energy does. It doesn't mention explicitly this VSS or this VSS. It rather sets out requirements that those VSS have to meet in order to be considered as a proof of compliance.
Okay. Then we have a question. Wait 1 second. A question related to the fact whether you know whether VSS are used in trade instruments like the GSP scheme.
They are not explicitly mentioned, but there are requirements on sustainability, and the GSP scheme also requires compliance with international conventions, which are also included in some VSS. So there is also a synergy in that.
Yes, maybe if I can add to that, there's been quite a bit of debate on whether VSS should be integrated in the GSP scheme, but so far it has not yet happened. And in the review of the GSP scheme, which is coming up in the next years, I don't expect that they will be integrated in the GSP scheme, for the reason that GSP really relates to government interactions, in the sense that it's a commitment between the EU and a partner country, and not between the EU and specific producers. And if you would start introducing VSS, that might actually change the setup of the whole. And there's a student who wants to know whether you know any specific voluntary VSS scheme that has proven to be particularly effective. So if you can give some examples of VSS which you think are more effective than other ones.
Well, as I said, you can always, when you read the literature on specific VSS, you can always find some examples of studies that are that show negative impacts or no impacts. But the FSC has quite a lot of positive impact studies. As I said, it's really a global VSS. It covers about 16% of the world's forest on its own today, which is really impressive. And there are studies that show a link between a slowing down of deforestation and the fact that the forests are certified by the FSC. Yeah, that's what comes to my mind now. Fair trade also scores quite well in some studies, but again, in other studies, in other contexts, you can find also problems. So I don't know if you have other ideas in mind, Axel.
Yes, well, there are certain VSS which I think are a bit more effective, like for instance also the Fair Wear Foundation, and that's the fact that they actually are very focused types of VSS. Like the Fair Wear Foundation basically only focuses on the production of textile, and then especially the sewing of textile in very specific countries. And they tend to achieve quite a bit in terms of labor rights protection, social protection, and environmental protection. But that's because they work very closely with the producers. And there's a bit of a trade-off in that sense that Charline mentioned. There's also a very important aspect of adoption of VSS. And the ones who tend to be quite effective in terms of really changing things on the ground are typically the ones who are more difficult to adopt, and where it's more costly to adopt them, and where it takes more time. So some of them then perform less in terms of how well they are adopted. So their impact on the ground is quite significant, but they are less adopted. While you have some VSS like FSC, which might have quite an impact on the ground and forest, and which are very highly adopted, which might have a general overall or a bigger impact on sustainability metrics. Okay, so I think that was it for today. Thank you very much, Charlie. Next, we'll turn the attention away from what's happening on the international level, on the global level, and we will start focusing on EU trade policy. And we will first introduce a general introduction to how the EU makes trade policy, what's included in the trade policy, and then the lectures afterwards we will focus on more specific issues. So thank you very much for attending the lecture, and hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.